Wreck-It Ralph is considered by many to be hands down one of the best Disney movies to come out of the 21st century, to the point that some would even argue it's a little underrated as far as general audiences are concerned. And I myself even dedicated an entire video to explaining why it's so good, which you can find a link in the description too. But that being said, that doesn't mean it's perfect, because while it is a lot better than many of the movies that came after it, there are a few minor points of contention surrounding certain aspects of the story, particularly when it comes to the Nicelanders and their initial treatment of Ralph. And today, I'd like to go over this aspect of Wreck-It Ralph to the best of my ability. And needless to say, there will be spoilers ahead, so if there's something Disney or Pixar related that you'd like to check out but haven't yet, you should probably remain on the lookout. This will be the only spoiler warning I'll be giving out. Okay, so if we're going to talk about the Nicelanders and how they treat Ralph, one character that must be immediately brought up is Gene, because simply put, he may just be one of the most hated characters in Disney history. Some have even said that they find Buck Cluck to be more sympathetic than him, though that does actually make sense, considering that for all of his faults, he does try to be a good father to his son, even if he fails miserably at it, and eventually owns up to those failures. In other words, even if it isn't enough for some people, at least Buck Cluck takes accountability for his actions and tries to be a good person, which is more than you'd ever get out of Gene in Wreck-It Ralph, because he antagonizes him to no end for doing his job, and that can't be stressed enough. Ralph only destroys the building because that's what he's been programmed to do, and yet everybody treats him as some kind of criminal, or like he really is the bad guy he pretends to be, even though he clearly isn't. And while all of that is bad enough, what makes Gene in particular stand out is just how irrational his hatred of Ralph really is, even dismissing him as, quote, just the guy who wrecks the building. But when Ralph proves him dead wrong by leaving the game and showing just how important he is, to the point that without him, there is no game, does Gene apologize for being so stupid? Nope. When Ralph returns, he pulls the too disappointed and disgusted to be mad act, and when Ralph tries to explain to him that he simply wanted the respect he deserved, Gene simply takes the moral high ground, thoroughly getting the last word over him. And considering that's their final on-screen interaction, it's really no wonder many fans of the movie hate him so much, because even if the ending obviously implies it, he's never shown owning up to his behavior and admitting that he was completely wrong to treat Ralph the way he did. And indeed, many have even said that while they love the movie, it never sat right with them that Gene got the last word on Ralph when everything that happens is more his fault than anybody else's, and yet he's able to claim victory by essentially scapegoating Ralph again. However, the scene isn't put in there for no reason, as it's actually meant to serve a very important purpose, because the whole point of the movie is that Ralph is tired of being the bad guy and wants to get a taste of what it's like to be a hero. But because Fix-It Felix Jr. is his only point of reference, and he's a pre-programmed hero with all the trimmings, Ralph has a very flawed idea of what being a hero actually entails, simply believing that they're people who get a medal for doing something they find easy. So thematically speaking, what Ralph needs to learn is how to be a real hero, which he does through his friendship with Vanellope. However, by accepting his old medal back from King Candy, destroying Vanellope's car, and game jumping in the first place, Ralph has ironically become a bigger villain than he ever was before, and therefore from a thematic standpoint, Gene was actually right to act disappointed in Ralph. Only, in execution, that doesn't quite work for a few reasons. The first of which being, Ralph thought he was doing the right thing when he destroyed Vanellope's car. He had been thoroughly manipulated into believing that there was a good chance Vanellope would die if she was allowed to be a normal racer. So he actually did do the heroic thing in that moment, especially because it was a very hard thing for him to do, but he did it anyway to save her. And what makes that even worse is that even the audience is led to believe that he did do the right thing at that point in the narrative, even if they will concede that it was a difficult choice. But the second, and more relevant to this video, reason that scene doesn't come across the way it should is something I already touched on, which is that it's pretty much all Gene's fault that they're in that position in the first place. Because simply put, the whole reason Ralph wants to become a hero is because he wants the respect he's rightfully owed. After all, he's arguably the most important character in the game and a very nice guy in his off time, and yet he's reviled as a villain and made an outcast by everyone in his game. And then Gene has the gall to imply that he isn't important while saying that if Ralph ever managed to win a medal, he'd let him live in the penthouse. Now let's pause right there and look at things from Ralph's perspective, because he's been an outcast for 30 years. He's feared and hated by everyone in his game and doesn't get any respect, all because he got saddled with being the bad guy. And considering what we see of him in the opening, 30 years of this treatment is obviously starting to give him major self-loathing issues, to the point that he's even starting to question if it's worth it to continue being the bad guy. And suddenly he's given the opportunity to get everything he ever wanted if he comes back to his game with a medal, meaning he'll no longer be an outcast. He'll be able to live alongside everybody else and maybe even finally get the respect he deserves. Is it any wonder he abandoned his game and jumped at the chance to get a medal? Because he wasn't looking for glory. He wasn't like Turbo and trying to fuel his ego or sense of entitlement. He just wanted to escape from his frankly awful living arrangement. And can anybody fault him for that? And what only makes Gene even worse in this department is how sure he is that Ralph won't even consider taking his challenge seriously, showing just how ignorant he really is. Frankly, the way the last scene between Ralph and Gene is presented, it almost makes it look as if Ralph should have just sucked it up and continued living his miserable existence for as long as his game was plugged in, alone in the garbage and hated as a villain for no reason. But there are a couple of things that keep this from coming across that way and ruining the movie entirely. The first is that there actually is a scene where one of the Nicelanders realizes just how bad Ralph has it, but it's arguably the wrong character. Because sure, Felix never considered how Ralph had it and was oblivious to what a miserable existence he led. But unlike the Nicelanders, that was more just thoughtlessness on his part than anything else. As in, because he's such a humble man living the high life, he simply thought that Ralph was living a happy existence as well, and never stopped to consider otherwise. But considering he's the only character to not be mean to him, and even treat him with something resembling respect, to the point that he's the only person in the game that Ralph doesn't feel any animosity towards and even considers a friend, the fact that there's a scene dedicated to him realizing just how bad Ralph has it, and is treated like that for no reason on top of that, isn't nearly as fulfilling as Gene being forced to eat crow and admit that the whole thing was his fault. But once again, the fact that at least the movie doesn't forget about his struggles and gives him a chance to speak his piece without petty retorts does go a long way in softening the blow of the earlier scene, because at least the narrative is freely admitting that the Nicelanders' treatment of him was not acceptable and that they were wrong for treating him the way they did. And, of course, the other reason is because the ending goes out of its way to show that the Nicelanders did learn their lesson and started treating him the way they should have all along. Meaning that even if the audience doesn't get to see it, such a moment where Gene does apologize to him almost certainly did happen. Again, obviously it would have been nice if such a scene were actually depicted rather than their last scene ending with him seemingly learning nothing and definitively getting the last word, but at least it's something. Because unlike some of Disney's later movies, the Nicelanders' treatment of Ralph may not be the point of the film, but at least it never forgets about it and does show that they learned the lesson they desperately needed to. So it's not like the movie doesn't address the problem, it's just that some might feel it doesn't address it enough. Because to go back to the scene in question, Gene is supposed to be seen as in the right since Ralph hasn't learned the lesson he needs to and has only made everything worse in his pointless quest. And it's only after this scene that he finally starts to learn what being a true hero is really all about. Only, in context, that's not the way it is at all. Because in actuality, his quest wasn't pointless. It was to gain respect. And many would argue that's truly what Ralph needs. To get respect he rightfully deserves. And becoming a hero is just a means to that end, rather than the other way around as the narrative tries to claim. But the thing is, this isn't actually the first time that a movie made under Pixar's creative direction has had this problem. Because as I've explained in many other videos, when Disney bought Pixar, the latter's way of doing things took over with them. And it hasn't always been for the best either. Like, for example, I even argued in another video that the original Toy Story's treatment of Woody is a little too brutal, to the point that it can be a little hard to watch him suffer. Because sure, Woody does have some issues to work out, and it wasn't exactly nice of him to try and knock Buzz behind the shelf, but at the same time, he's very responsible as the leader of the toys and generally means well. And not to mention, he knew Buzz would easily get out and just wanted him out of the way for 5 minutes, and is notably horrified when his plan backfires and is genuinely concerned for him. In other words, Woody was a bit of a jerk that needed to learn a lesson, yes, but the narrative arguably goes too far in that regard, because in the end, he needed to be taken down a peg, but he was still a nice guy at heart. And just to put it into perspective, Cusco, who's infinitely worse at the beginning of his film than Woody is in his, arguably isn't put through the ringer as badly as Woody is. Or to go with something more similar to Wreck-It Ralph, the main theme of Up is knowing when to let go of something and move on from it, which is why the villain, Charles Muntz, never stops trying to capture Kevin, even at the cost of his reputation, sanity, and eventually his life. But similar to Ralph, in context, it's actually kind of easy to feel sorry for him, as I even explained in another video, which you can also find a link in the description too, because he was unfairly labeled a fraud, and a stupid bird, of all things, is the only thing keeping him from regaining the respect and admiration he had most definitely earned. So is it any wonder he goes insane? Now obviously this doesn't apply nearly as much as it does to Wreck-It Ralph, as even with that going for him, it obviously doesn't justify the murder of a dozen innocent people. It's just that the audience might be more sympathetic to him than the writers intended, because he honestly is a pretty tragic character, all things considered. Still a villain, most definitely, but a tragic one nonetheless. And the narrative is even guilty of this with Carl to an extent, as pretty much any time he refuses to let go of the house, it's portrayed as a bad thing, especially when he saves it from being burned. But the thing is, in context, that was honestly the right call to make, as even beyond the fact that his entire life is in that house, and most people aren't just going to let that go in a heartbeat, if he had freed Kevin instead, they would have been left stranded and at the mercy of a deranged killer with no means of escape. But by saving the house, it got Muntz off their back and allowed them to use it to save her later on. So the fact that the film treats him as in the wrong when he honestly did do the best thing he could is a bit jarring, especially because he goes on to react very defensively, as if he knows Russell is right and just doesn't want to admit it, when once again, in the context of the scene, that isn't really the case. Again, obviously this stuff isn't enough to ruin the movie, but it is still interesting to note how Pixar sometimes puts their themes ahead of the context involved in any given scene, and this would only get even worse over time, with one of the most infamous examples of that being Raya and the Last Dragon. Raya is supposed to be seen as in the wrong, and Narami as in the right, when she says that she's just as responsible for Sisu's death for not trusting her, when anybody who's paying attention clearly knows that Raya was fully justified in not trusting Narami for several reasons. Honestly, when it comes to a movie's themes and the context of the story not lining up, Raya and the Last Dragon simply blows the others away with how bad it is. But even Big Hero 6 is also guilty of this as well, since Hero is supposed to be seen as in the wrong for ordering Professor Callahan's death. This despite the fact that he was responsible for the death of one of his students, and won't even own up to it on top of that, tried to kill a bunch of teenagers, and put countless innocent people in danger. Now obviously in this case, killing him probably still wasn't the best thing to do, but Hero is way more justified in wanting to stop him than the narrative lets on, even if it is for the wrong reason. And there's also the fact that the movie still tries to paint Professor Callahan as a tragic villain, despite not only being guilty of everything I just mentioned, but doesn't even stop to consider that maybe he went too far, considering he had just driven a teenager to attempt to murder him, but instead just commits even harder to his meaningless revenge quest. But I already got more into that aspect of him in a separate video, which you can also find a link in the description too. So the point here is, Gene getting the last word over Ralph, with the narrative ignoring just how big a role he played in Ralph's actions for the sake of its theme, is really nothing new, and something that would happen to varying degrees before and after this film. Honestly, an example of this kind of idea done right would be Finding Nemo, as while some would argue that Marlin's paranoia about the ocean being so dangerous is more than justified, the movie does put in the effort to show how his overprotectiveness is the biggest danger of all, as it drives Nemo to rebel and invite that danger to him. So while it can still be argued that Marlin does have a point, it's a lot easier to concede that the narrative is right to say that he needs to loosen up and trust Nemo to take care of himself, as otherwise he's going to end up losing him in more ways than one. And what also helps is that Nemo also apologizes for the way he acted as well, allowing both characters to take appropriate accountability for their behavior and admit that the other was right to an extent. Because again, in this case the narrative isn't trying to argue that Marlin is wrong for saying the ocean is dangerous, just that he's way overdoing it to the point that his attempts to protect Nemo are doing way more harm than good. In other words, what the narrative and the context behind the character's actions are trying to say are in complete harmony, which is what all the previous examples to varying degrees lack. Now, as I stressed before, while the more extreme cases of this, such as Raya and the Last Dragon and Big Hero 6, resulted in narrative problems, in most of the examples mentioned, it isn't enough to ruin the entire movie. But the reason I wanted to focus specifically on Gene from Wreck-It Ralph is because of how easy it is to see why so many were frustrated that he managed to get the last word and claim moral superiority when the whole thing was honestly his fault, and the narrative never holds him accountable for it, because the Nightlander's treatment of Ralph was more a plot device to get Ralph to learn what it takes to be a hero, rather than the point of the story in the first place. Now once again, the fact that it never forgets about that plot device is what makes that scene forgivable, but given just how cruel Gene had behaved towards him, the writers really should have considered how they played that scene, considering Ralph would have been more than justified in chewing him out for trying to blame the whole thing on him, though that may help explain why they went so far out of their way to justify Ralph as being in the wrong in the sequel, so that there would be no question that Vanellope was right to chew him out. But if you're a frequent watcher of my channel, you'll already know why that didn't work for 100 different reasons. But getting back to Gene, that's the reason he's so hated where King Candy is beloved. Because not only is King Candy a blast to watch, but he also makes for a great villain that most definitely gets what's coming to him in the end. But because Gene is just a huge jerk that treats Ralph like garbage for no reason, and then gets to have the last word when Ralph tries to prove him wrong because of a bet he made, really, do I even need to explain it? Let me just say, as a man who's written books, I definitely would have done it differently. I mean, obviously the theme of the story is still important, but there were other ways to play that scene without Gene getting the last word and Ralph still coming to the same realization. In fact, it arguably would have meant more if Ralph had given Gene a brutal tongue lashing that left him realizing just how responsible for the whole thing he really was, only for Ralph to still not feel any better because ultimately he needs more than just winning over Gene to feel fulfilled and happy. That would have honestly been a much better way to play that scene, as it ties into the movie's themes while not coming at the expense of what had already been established, as well as make Ralph's guilt feel more organic. Because, like I've said many times before, if there's one thing audiences hate, it's when the narrative claims one thing about a character while their actions tell a different story. And the fact that Gene is portrayed as deserving of getting the last word, when he most definitely doesn't, might just be one of the worst examples of that. The only thing that honestly keeps it from being too bad is that Gene wasn't meant to be a likable character to begin with, meaning the audience's resulting hatred of him isn't really a bad thing anyway. Okay, I think I've gone on about this for long enough, so now I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you believe that the final interaction between Ralph and Gene in Wreck-It Ralph should have gone completely differently, and that Pixar's writing methods are to blame for why the scene goes down the way it does? Or do you believe it was done perfectly and that I'm wrong about this whole topic? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And like I just said, you don't have to agree with anything I said in this video just because you watched it. You can feel absolutely any way you want to about both Wreck-It Ralph and Pixar's storytelling style, and if you think I did both of them a complete disservice, that is totally fine. And thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.